realized the title that I wrote is not quite accurate. The many failures of the theory of evolution would take 6 or 7 hours to do thoroughly. I haven't got time to do all of them. So maybe a better title would be Some of the Many Failures of Evolution. And instead of just racing through about 15, what I'd rather do is try to explain one after another in a slow and thorough fashion so that it will be understood. Instead of just forming an impression, gosh, there's a lot of stuff out there, maybe you'll understand what the problems are, and that way you'll have some understanding, you can share it with others. It might be better than just racing through a whole bunch. There are two different kinds of problems that you can raise for a proposition. Somebody says, here's my position, here are the reasons for it, I think it's correct, and I think I have adequate reason to defend it, substantiate it. There are two different ways that someone can respond critically. One way is to say, you're wrong. I know what you think, but you're wrong, and I can show it to you, I'll prove to you that you're wrong. The other way is to say, I don't know whether you're wrong or right, but your reasons aren't good reasons for your position. The truth is you don't know that you're right. And when you appreciate that your reasons aren't good reasons, then what you should do is say, gee, I thought, but now I really don't know. The critic may not know either. He just may be able to show you that your reasons aren't good reasons. So I'll give you an example. Someone says, I'm right, because I read it in the Encyclopedia Britannica. I say to him, really? I want you to know there are 4 top encyclopedias in the world, of which the Britannica is one. And the other 3 are ABC, and all of the other 3 disagree. Furthermore, there's been a report recently of people who went personally and investigated the issue, and they came back and said that the Britannica report is wrong. So I think you're making a mistake. It's wrong. I know you read it in the Britannica, but it's wrong anyway. That's the first type of critique. Second type of critique, the guy says, I know it's true because I read it in the Britannica, and I ask him, would you please take a look at the date of the Britannica you read? He looks at it, he says, oh, it's 1982. And I say, look, it's 2014. Lots of things changed in that period of time. I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but relying on the 1982 Britannica is not good evidence. It's not a good reason to accept it. You got to look at a later edition. There, I'm not telling him he's wrong. I'm just saying he hasn't got a good enough reason to assume that he's right. He hasn't got support for saying that he's right. Now, these are both failures. If you can show the position is wrong, that's a colossal failure. If you can show that the person doesn't have good reason for his position, that's also a failure. He's presenting to you as if it's true and he knows it's true. He's presenting it to you as if you're required to accept it because of his reasons, and you show him that that's just not the case. I think there's excellent critique of the latter kind, that evolution in its present condition can't claim to have good reasons. That doesn't make it wrong, but it means no one should say he knows it's true, and no one should present it to others if they have an obligation or responsibility to accept it as true. There's also some evidence against its truth. I wouldn't say the evidence against its truth is conclusive, but it definitely should make a person less sure, and then it contributes to the first conclusion that you haven't got good enough evidence to accept it as correct. And that's my bottom line. My bottom line is I can't say, I don't know whether it's true or false, not on the basis of scientific or logical reasons, but I know, I believe for sure that there isn't enough support for it to accept it as true, which means at the very least the person ought to say, maybe it's possible, but I haven't got good enough reason to accept it. I don't know whether it's true or not. And that will be a gigantic revolution for a whole population of people who either honestly believe they know it's true or pretend to believe that because otherwise they'll lose their jobs. Okay, Now, the first remark in this regard, and I think this is, in a way, the most powerful, it's simple, it's direct, and I'll put it to you with a couple of examples, and then I'll apply it to the evolution case. I invite you to a demonstration. In this demonstration, there's a thin pole with a swivel, and on top of the swivel is a revolver, a gun. And the gun can swivel 360 degrees. If you give it a twist, it will go round and round. 50 yards away is a target, a circular target, 1 foot in diameter. And I show you the following demonstration. I twist the gun, and it goes round and around, and then it shoots once and hits the target. I do that 5 times. Each time I twist it, and it goes round and around, shoots once and hits the target all 5 times. And I say, would you like to know how it does that? And you say, yeah, I'd like to know how it does that. How does it do that? I'll tell you how. The gun has in it a laser beam. And the target has a reflector to the laser beam. And it has a hair trigger so that when it gets a reflection back from the laser, it fires. And in that way, it's designed and it's machined to shoot just when it's going to hit the target. And that's why I hit the target 5 times in a row. Okay. I'm offering that to you as an explanation. Just offering it. That's case 1. Case 2. You ask me, how does it do that? I tell you this. I'll tell you how it does it. I just spin it. Now there's a timer on it which times it to shoot. The time is set to a random number generator, so it just makes it shoot at random. And when I spin it, it spins at random. And it hit the target 5 times in a row by accident. By accident. Those are the 2 explanations I offer you. Now, I think your attitude ought to be, well, the first one's credible. You don't know if it's true or not. Maybe you're just lying. Maybe something else is going on. But if there really is a laser going out, there's a reflector, and lasers are almost instantaneous at that distance, and there's a hair trigger to it, that's a mechanism that could do it. That's a plausible explanation. By accident, 5 times in a row, 50 yards, 1 foot in diameter, that's not going to happen. Now, wait a minute, that's not going to happen. It could happen by accident. It could. Just you figure the chances are 1 in 10 trillion. And that's not a credible explanation. To say something happened by accident where the probability is 1 in 10 trillion is just too unlikely to accept. I think if you offer the second explanation, the right response is, I can't accept that. It's just too unlikely to be true. It's got to be something else. I can't take that seriously. I hope this is ABCs. And if it's not ABCs, then suppose I spin it around 25 times in a row. Right? Then the probability that was 1 septillion. Right? Whatever it is, at a certain point, you're going to say, it's too unlikely to be true. I take that to be obvious. Okay, that's step 1. Step 2, another case. I have an object, and on one side of the object, I've painted an X. Now, I tell you, I threw the object into the air, and 3 times in a row, it landed on the X. And I tell you, it landed on the X by accident. I didn't throw it in any special way. It's not weighted. It's not magnetized. There are no carvings in the object that catch the air currents and make it land on one side. It fell down 3 times in a row on the X by accident. Is that a plausible explanation? The answer is, I've left out one crucial piece of information, which you may have sort of mentally filled in, because it's common, but I didn't say it. I didn't tell you how many sides the object has. You may have assumed it was a coin, in which case the probability is 1/8. That's not outrageous. That happens 12.5% of the time. Suppose it's a shilya gun, which has 1,000 sides. That means that the probability of throwing it into the air and getting it come down 3 times in a row on the X side is 1 in a billion. That's not reasonable. So a coin is reasonable, and a 1,000-sided piece is not reasonable. Suppose I don't tell you how many sides it has. I don't tell you. What should your attitude be towards my explanation that it happened by accident? Your attitude ought to be, you haven't given me enough information to make up my mind. If the probability is reasonably high, I'll accept it as a plausible explanation. If the probability is extremely low, I will not accept it as a plausible explanation. If you refuse to let me figure out what the probability is, then you have not given me you haven't given me enough information to rationally make up my mind whether to accept it or not. I think that's ABC. Now, the evolutionist community, and I use that word advisedly, evolutionism is another religion. The evolutionist community has been challenged repeatedly over decades. Give us a probability. Give us a probability. Sometimes they've been challenged by people who think they can calculate the probability and show that it's very low. I'm skeptical about that. But give us a positive probability. Thomas Nagel, in his book, Mind and Cosmos, which came out last year, made the same challenge as many have made. No one has even offered such a probability. No believer in evolution has even tried to present such a probability. No one has ever taken the challenge to give me a probability that what you say happened by accident really happened by accident the way you say it happened. I think the very simple, clear, forced conclusion at this point is there isn't enough backing to the theory to accept it as true. You claim something happened by accident. In order to make up my mind reasonably whether to accept it or not, I have to know the probability. If you don't give me the probability, then there isn't enough backing to it to accept it as true. It might be true. I'm not saying it's false, but I certainly don't have to say, I have to agree that it's true. Now, some people have replied to this reasoning in the following way. Let's think what you're asking for. You're asking for probability that evolution is true. Well, evolution is a picture of how you start with something that makes copies of itself, and then you end up with butterflies and sequoias and platypuses and coral reefs and who knows what. But golly, starting from the first thing that made copies of itself and arriving at our envelope of life, you're talking about millions or more of changes, each of which contributed to the development. To give you a probability of that happening, I'd have to know in some detail what each of the changes was. I'd have to know the conditions under which it took place, what's the intensity of cosmic rays in the area, and what was the temperature of the water, and the salinity of the water, and other chemicals available, and what was the composition of the atmosphere, and this changing over billions of years. I don't know all of that. I don't know all of that. Maybe we'll never know all of that. You're asking for something that's completely impossible to deliver. Okay, I hear you. It's impossible to deliver. What am I supposed to make of that? So what? So it's impossible to deliver. Then the follow-up is, well, that's unreasonable. It's unreasonable to ask people for things that are impossible to deliver. I don't see why. I don't see why. Or rather, instead of asking you to deliver it, pointing out the consequences of not delivering it. You don't have information to give me a probability. If you don't have a probability, there isn't reason to accept it. Now you say, but it's impossible to get a probability. So then I say, then it will always be impossible to accept it. Because you need a probability in order to reasonably be required to accept it. And if it's impossible to get one, too bad. So much the worse for you. Then throw up your hands and say, this is hopeless. There are, after all, propositions in science that are hopeless. You believe in evolution. So you believe there was a first cell. Now I ask you, was that first cell in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? I think you're likely to say that's hopeless. It's just not enough information, not enough evidence available, even in principle, to determine where the first cell was. Okay, then you don't know. If you don't know, don't tell me it was definitely in the southern hemisphere. Just confess you don't know. If it's impossible to get the information, then you'll never know. Life is like that. The world is like that. There's some things we'll never know. Too bad. Maybe we'll never know whether evolution is true or not. So then we'll never know it. Now, one more quip, just one more, make sure we're talking the same language, and then if you have questions about this, I'll be happy to discuss it. I think this is it's like a master argument. Now, this is not my argument. I just thought up the examples because I'm into education and communication. But the word evolution has many different meanings. Ernst Mayr, professor emeritus at Harvard, I assume he's still alive, true believer in evolution and one of the field's best expositors. He also has a taste for philosophical thinking. He wrote books and essays, which I found very instructive. He has an essay on the different meanings of the word evolution, and this can cause real confusion. If I remember correctly, I remember 5 different meanings. I think other people say there are more. So it's just one of those things you got to keep in mind. Evolution sometimes means things have changed. They haven't always been the same. Things have gotten bigger, some things have gotten smaller, some things went extinct, some new species appeared. Things have not always been the same in terms of what life there is. That's the simplest. There was a 19th century German biologist whose name escapes me at the moment, who said, and it's been quoted hundreds of times, evolution is as obvious as that the earth goes around the sun. What almost nobody knows, and Meyer points this out, when he said evolution is obvious, what he meant was things have changed. They haven't always been the same. That's a reasonable statement. The fossils, even within our time span, the fossil shows marked changes in the types of life that exist on the planet. Anybody who holds that life has never changed is someone who just saying something that's pretty obviously wrong, maybe as obvious as the fact that the earth goes around the sun. Then the second meaning of evolution is the changes have taken place gradually. Evolution as opposed to revolution, where changes take place rapidly. That's not obvious. The fossil record does not support that. Some places it doesn't support it in glorious, great detail, like flowering plants that appear in the fossil record with no antecedents, like insects that appear in the fossil record with no antecedents. So that's the second meaning of evolution. That's not the one we're talking about. We're not talking about that one either. The third meaning of evolution is that all life goes back to a single common ancestor. There was a first living thing, and everything branched out from that first living thing. That didn't have to be at all. Whatever it is that caused the existence of the first living thing might have spontaneously caused the existence of 10 living things, 100 living things. And each one could have given rise to a line of descent. But no, the theory of evolution is committed to the idea that there's a single thing. Then there's a certain description of how new species arise. You have groups of items, and they're bunched in classes, and the classes are isolated from one another. What was the name of Darwin's famous book? Origin of Species. He thought that was the key problem, to describe where species come from. And there's a certain way of describing how the changes give rise to new species. It's a fourth meaning of evolution. None of these is what we're talking about. None of these is what we are talking about. One second. The fifth meaning, when we are talking about, is this. What is the cause of the changes? What makes the changes happen? What's the explanation of the changes? The theory of evolution says the major, the most important, the primary cause of the changes is random variations, which then are subject to selection. The random variations have effect on how the changed organism survives. And these have to be heritable. That is to say, they have to be inherited from organism to organism. And that's what does it. Yeah, there's some debate about other contributing factors, but the major factor that does the job is random variations plus selection. That's what we're talking about. When we talk about probability, it's that description of evolution that we're talking about. You see the envelope of life. You say that there were changes and gradual changes. All that you could conceivably verify from the fossil record without an explanation, without a cause, without an engine, without knowing what makes it happen that way. That's a separate discipline, a separate study. What we're talking about is the engine that makes it happen. Now, the reason that's important is because the engine that makes it happen is founded on random variation. Selection only preserves the ones that are successful and eliminates the ones that are not successful. You can't create anything with selection. You can only cut out the unsuccessful ones with selection. Behind selection is something that's generating new types, new features. That's where it's an unguided, unmanaged, unfocused. I know the word random is tricky. The word random has all sorts of technical meanings. No one has a good meaning for the word random. Too bad, it's another problem. But it's accidental, unguided, unfocused, no intelligence behind it. Then I want a probability. That's no different from the gun spinning on a pivot or an object landing on the X 3 times. It's something which is supposed to happen by accident. Well, I want a probability for that. And if you don't give me a probability, there isn't enough reason to accept that it's true. Period. Questions up to here. Now, I've challenged people with this. I've told them, write to your biology professors, write to your philosophy professors, get me an answer to this. I know there isn't an answer because Thomas Nagel put it in a book which caused howls and shrieks of protest, but nobody answered it. Nobody even tried to answer. Nobody said, oh, you say there's no probability? Here it is, A, B, and C. Nobody even tried to do that. Howls of protest and all that, but nobody answered that point. And as I say, it's not a new point. It's been going on for decades. I think that's conclusive. Try it out. I'm sure you know true believers. I'm sure you know people who willing to live and die for evolution. Ask them that question. I've been talking about this like this way for 20 years. No one has even offered an answer to the question. I think that's very important. Are we together so far? Okay. Now there's something else called vestigial organs. Vestigial organs are features of the body that either don't do any job at all, or they do the jobs badly. Vestigial usually refers to things that don't do any job. Or they're badly designed. And here there are two failures, a philosophical failure and a factual failure. Let's see how it's supposed to go. Let's say there are features of the body that serve no purpose, which would be an indication of bad design. A good designer doesn't put in things that don't have any purpose. Or features that are badly designed, that don't do their job in the best way that they could. We could easily think of designs that would do it better. Let's say that's true. So what? Well, what's that got to do with evolution? What's it got to do with evolution? So the proposal here is double. Number one, it supports evolution. And number two, it rules out an explanation in terms of a creator. It rules out the explanation in terms of a creator because creator, we assume, could do better than that. Creator could make excellent design or perfect design. And if it's clear that the design is bad, then it's not going to be a creator who did it. Whereas on the other hand, evolution can explain it. Because how is evolution supposed to work? You got a thing that's waddling around, trying to get food out and reproduce and run away from its predators and adapt. And there are other things running around, competing for food, and there are things that want to eat it, and things it wants to eat, and it's just, doing its best in its circumstances. If it succeeds, that means it succeeds on the whole. The fact that it succeeds doesn't mean that it's perfectly designed. It just means that on the whole, with its good design features and bad design features, on the whole, it's good enough to keep going. Now, suppose you have a mutation and that changes it a little bit. Makes it a little bit better. So then it'll be better. And then it'll be better than the old ones, and outcompete the old ones and do better in the environment. No one thought that it's perfect. Furthermore, when you make a little step to get better, that little step to get better has to be good for the thing you're working with. And the thing you're working with might not tolerate steps to get better that don't help it, because it's carrying along all the stuff that it has so far. Eyes. Are eyes useful? Sure, but not under your armpit. That's not going to be very useful. Because if you have to see things, you're going to walk around like this. The saber-toothed tiger is going to get you for sure. Right? Not everything helps. A thing helps because it grafts onto where you are. You are necessarily carrying along with you everything you've got. When you make a change, it's in addition to everything you've got. Now, let's imagine, here's an example that I actually use. There are animals that are underground which have eyes but are blind. Because the suggestion is they're living underground. Living underground where there's no light. Where there's no light, there's no use for sight. So keeping all the neural machinery that underlies sight is pointless. You can put it to better use with smell or with digging or something else. The eyes are carried along. They had eyes before, so the evolution hasn't devised a way. Carrying the eyes isn't too expensive if the brain is disconnected from that. It's just a piece of fold of flesh, that's all. Okay, deep sea fish, same way. So you carry along the eyes. Vestigial organs are things that once were useful, but then you change your style of life. They're no longer useful because your style of life doesn't need them anymore. And evolution just hasn't gotten around to cleaning them up and eliminating them. That's what evolution predicts. When you find vestigial organs, that's evidence for evolution, and it's also evidence against the main competing hypothesis, which is that God did it. Both ends of this story are wrong. First of all, enormous progress has been made in the last 20 years in discovering uses for vestigial organs, and the fact that what used to be thought were poorly designed organs or features of the body are really not poorly designed at all, but optimally designed. The appendix plays a role in the immune system. So do the adenoids. The eye, even Dawkins wrote that the eye proves the designer is incompetent, because you have the retina, and then you have the optic nerve that goes up to the brain, and the retina comes from inside. The optic nerve comes from inside the retina. By inside, I mean closer to the surface of the face, and goes through the retina, through a hole, and then goes up to the brain. And that means that there's a little hole in the center of the retina, and at that point you can't see, because you haven't got any retinal cells to be sensitive to the light. And that's what's called a blind spot. You have a blind spot, one in each eye, where the optic nerve goes back to the retina. So, until very recently, the attitude was, what a kludge! Anybody would understand that you got to put the optic nerve behind the retina, not in front of the retina and go back through. It's ridiculous. And there are creatures that have it that way. The eye is very, very popular in evolution. According to Ernst Mayr, the eye evolved independently at least 40 times. Independently. It's a very popular thing. Convergent evolution like that is something that one has to talk about, but I don't have time for it tonight. At any rate, it turns out, contrary to what they used to think, about 5 years ago, some studies were done. Having the optic nerve outside and going through a hole in the center is optimal. It's not a detracting factor, it's optimal. Because there are certain cells that are necessary to keep stability of the retina, and they are connected to the optic nerve, and all of them are supported by the optic nerve going back through from the outside, and that makes it optimal. Furthermore, the blind spot. When's the last time you noticed your blind spot? When's the last time you missed the bus because your blind spot got in the way and you couldn't see the number? You're not even conscious of the blind spot. Till you told about it, you never notice it. No one ever got eaten by a saber-toothed tiger because the tiger disappeared in the blind spot and you couldn't see it, and therefore it's tiny. It's tiny. And the brain fills in the background to cover the spot so you're not conscious of it. So the whole story was wrong. I want to give you a little bit more detailed example of the same story where it's wrong, and this is just, it's beyond belief. What does DNA do? Until about 15 years ago, the consensus was DNA codes for the production of proteins. The DNA sits there, RNA sidles up and attaches itself to a section of the DNA, copies its structure, then it detaches and it goes over to a ribosome, and there it creates a protein. The DNA is instructions for creating proteins. Okay, how much of the DNA programs for proteins? 4%. 96% does not code for proteins. What's the 96% doing? Answer, it's vestigial, it's doing nothing. It was called junk DNA. That was its official title in evolutionary biology. Junk DNA. What a spectacular example of God not doing it. 96% is junk, only 4%. But evolution predicts this. That DNA comes from some primitive animal ancestor, which came from a squid, which came from a clam, which came from a colony of bacteria. The DNA is pulled along, tweaked here and tweaked there to improve itself, and all the old stuff is just carried along, to the point where 96% of it is just dead weight, doing nothing. About 15 years ago, this started to come apart, because people started to find functions for the so-called junk DNA. A paper came out in Nature, this was only about 3 years ago, a paper in Nature with 350 authors. Science papers sometimes have a lot of authors, but this is a worldwide effort, charting chemical activity of the DNA. So far, they have found that 80% of the DNA is chemically active. If it's chemically active, then the assumption is that it makes a difference in what goes on in the cell, in which case evolution can apply to it, selection can apply to it, and then the idea that it's functionless becomes very, very hard to swallow. But they have found specific cases of non-coding DNA, and they know what the function is. Here's the one that I find spectacular. 96% doesn't code. Take the 4% it does. Little stretches, which the RNA copies and then makes proteins out of. But guess what? In the stretch that does code, there are little pieces that don't code either, called interons. They're just junk in the way. So here's what happens. The RNA copies it, including the little pieces that don't code. Then the RNA splits up into pieces. The little pieces that don't code drop out. The other pieces sew back together, and that sewed back together goes over to the ribosome and creates the protein. What a kludge! What a Rube Goldberg procedure! You got the thing that codes with things that don't code, copy it all, detach, fold out the ones that don't code, then reattach it together. What a stupid, inefficient system. Guess what they discovered? Yeah, the little pieces that drop out don't code. But the rest of the pieces that do code, that you sew together to make the instructions for making the protein, you can sew them together in more than one way. You can sew them together in 20 different ways and make 20 different proteins. That means the single section of the DNA is coding for 20 proteins. Not one, but 20. That multiplies the informational content of the DNA by 20, the functional information content. And guess what? The little pieces that drop out sew the other ones back together. They determine the orders in which the other ones can be sewed together. Are they useless? Are they junk? No, they are not. They actually multiply the coding capacity of the DNA by 20. So they don't code. So what? That doesn't make them useless, functionless, junk. Another thing, these complicated molecules, like proteins, and certainly like DNA, you've seen the beautiful graphic accounts of the double helix of the DNA. But of course, DNA never exists as a super long chain, yards long, of a double helix. It's all bundled up together, wound up on itself over and over again. Proteins are that way too. They're all wound up on themselves. How do they wind up? What makes them wind up? Does it matter how they wind up? It matters a lot. If it winds up the right way, then it does all the things it has to do. If it winds up another way, it won't do those things. Sometimes it'll do nothing, and sometimes it'll do destruction. It's got to wind up the right way. What winds it up? There are no spools in there winding it up. No. The molecules that make up the DNA have magnetic forces. And they stick to one another in a particular way. It's an unsolved problem. How something that's thousands of links long folds up in a fraction of a second the right way every time. No one knows how that happens, but that's how it happens. But what holds them together is the magnetic properties of the molecules. So a lot of the molecules are in there to make sure that it folds the right way. They don't code for protein, but so what? So what? It's got to fold the right way, otherwise it won't do anything. Any molecule that's there to make sure it folds up the right way is functional. It's not junk. And so it goes. Every week there's another discovery as to what the DNA, what the pieces of the DNA are doing. So from the idea that 96% is junk, now that idea is on the run. Most have said we shouldn't talk about junk DNA anymore. It's just a mistake. The whole thing's a mistake. And it's an open field, what the DNA does. Now I'm going to tell you a footnote. Many people have heard of this. It was very, very widely publicized that human beings and chimpanzees share 98.6% of their DNA. So that was a cause célèbre. And I will take just a moment to explain the philosophical problem here. Well, look, the difference between us and chimpanzees is 1.4% of the DNA. Now listen, that's science. That's a number. 1.6 is precise. Seems to me that human beings and chimpanzees are very, very different. But I have to be wrong. That's just an impression. That's just a feeling. 1.6 is a number. It's a precise number. So that has to be right. So my feeling that we're so different is wrong. We're really very, very much the same. 98.6% the same. Because the scientific picture is a number. A number is precise. Well, first of all, the conclusion is stupid. Maybe what you should have thought is, obviously we're very, very different from chimpanzees, so, surprise, surprise, 1.6% difference of DNA can make very big differences. Don't use the little number 1.6 to prove that the differences aren't big. Can't you tell the difference between manned mission to the moon and using a stick to get ants out of an anthill? I mean, you don't see a difference there? A difference of, a difference of orders of magnitude? So they use a tool. They make a tool by stripping off the side branches and put it in, the ants come out and they eat them. And we put men on the moon. That's a 1.6% difference? Come on, be realistic. Be serious, 1.4% difference. So you should have said, a very little difference in the genes can make a gigantic difference in the output. Okay, but guess what, boys and girls? When they said that our DNA and their DNA is 98.6% the same, they only meant the 4% that codes for proteins. Because only the 4% that codes for proteins is really doing anything, and all the rest is junk, so they didn't take account of the junk. So it's a mistake based on a mistake. Now that you know that the DNA is, much of it has now been proven to be functional, 80% is chemically active, so you ought to measure the comparison between human and chimpanzee DNA across the board, and then the overlap is about 70%, not 98.6%. It's a 30% difference. That can account for a lot. But that's the kind of mistakes that are made. So we're talking about vestigial organs, we're talking about mistakes, bad design. One more, there's a whole field, you should look this up, this is absolutely fascinating, bioengineering. Bioengineering is where engineers want to build something, they look into the biological world, how the biological world performs that function, and they get inspiration as to how to build something that will do it. Because very often the biological world does it best, or at least far better than they can do without it, and than they can imagine. A lot of this is on discovery.org. Now, when your friends tell you, oh, that's a creationist site, you tell them that you're just bitterly prejudiced. Go back to your prejudices and leave me alone. I want to understand the world. And they have a lot of very good scientific information there. Certain animals and certain fish, when they move forward, wiggle. They wiggle, they waffle as they move forward. Engineers will tell you that's dumb. You're moving against the medium, especially fish, you're moving against the medium. The sleeker you are, the more streamlined you are, the less resistance you get from the medium. If you waffle, you're going to create more resistance. It's going to slow you down. So it's just bad design. So they thought. It's also written in all the engineering textbooks that there are two competing features, and the more you improve one, the more you lose in the other. One is speed and one is maneuverability. The faster you go, the less maneuverable you are. That's an axiom in engineering textbooks. Guess what? If you move with a wiggle, you can improve both of them simultaneously. They discovered that by watching the way fish move. So the engineering textbooks are wrong. It's possible to improve both speed and maneuverability simultaneously if you put in a wiggle. And now they're engineering wiggles. If evolution is just carrying along all the past junk and making improvements that, on whole, give you better survival, but of course carry along a lot of failures at the same time, then this field of bioengineering is not going to get a lot. It's going to run out of stuff because lots and lots of stuff in the human body is badly designed. It turns out that this claim of bad design is something which is just, when you learn the details and look at the new discoveries, they're learning now that, at least in some cases, the coding of the DNA can be read forwards and backwards. Read it forwards, it codes for one thing. Read the same thing backwards, it codes for something else. Can you write a code that's read forwards and backwards? Show me a computer science code that's read in that way. Show me a computer science code that codes simultaneously for 20 different things. You can't do that. Biology does it. Does it look like a kludge? Does it look like 96% of the thing is all junk? It doesn't look like that. Now, if evolution tells me there ought to be a lot of junk, evolution trumpeted the 96% of junk DNA as a very strong argument that evolution is true. What should they say when it turns out not to be correct? I think they should say, well, then, we weren't right about that. You weren't right about that. That makes you reduce your confidence that you're right altogether. Now, on the other side, to say that since there are faults in the design of the body, if there are faults, if you can demonstrate there are faults, that proves that it's not the result of a creator. There's a missing premise here. It may be obvious, but just one little piece of background. There's a good philosopher named Peter van Inwagen, who's a religious Christian philosopher. He's done work in general philosophy and philosophy of religion. And he made the following observation, which I think is, I don't say true, but it's very important. If you want to arrive at a religious conclusion, in your premise somewhere, you've got to have a religious premise. You can't start with purely scientific material and arrive at a religious conclusion. In the argument for a religious conclusion, there's got to be some religious premise somewhere. Otherwise, you're not talking about the right subject. Sort of like doing chemistry and arriving at a conclusion in art criticism. Chemistry alone is not going to give you a conclusion in art criticism. Okay, now, how is this one supposed to work? Well, the idea is there's bad design in the body, and God is capable of much better design. So, what? There shouldn't be bad design in the body? If God designed it, there shouldn't be bad design in the body because he's capable of much better design? Surely that's incomplete. I don't do everything I'm capable of doing. Do you? Do you everything that you can do? No, you have to know also what you want to do. If you want to do it and you're capable of doing it, then presumably, under normal circumstances, you should do it. The fact that God is capable of it doesn't conflict with bad design. You have to know that he wants to avoid bad design. Do you know that? How do you know that? What do you know about God? You're a biologist? You don't know anything about God. You got a clue about God. How can you derive your conclusion that God didn't do it? You have to know whether God would want to produce perfectly designed artifacts or not. That's just a piece of logic. From our point of view, the premise is false. Because one of the major understandings of how God relates to the world is that he hides his presence, doesn't show his presence. That being the case, to find things which look like bad design, for us would be natural. We would expect that. We wouldn't expect God to have everything turned out so seemingly naturally with perfect design. If that were so, it would be just obvious that some superior intelligence was doing it. So you can't get to an argument against God's design from pointing out failures in the design of the body for two reasons. Number one, you haven't got any failures in the design of the body that you can point to that you know for sure, given the ones that they've lost recently. And second of all, that would require information about God that you don't have. But this is a whole area where they made predictions and relied on this evidence, and it turns out not to be correct. I guess I'll give you one more example, and then we'll quit. There are holes in the fossil record. Big holes, like I said, insects, flowering plants. There's a giant hole between the ancestor of the whale and the whale. The ancestor of the whale is supposed to be some smallish land creature, something like a fox. Something like a fox. Now, if you look on the websites recently, the last couple of years, they're trumpeting that they have intermediaries and so forth and so on. They even have a leg bone in a whale. Well, what would a leg bone be doing in a whale if it didn't come from something that had legs and needed legs? But first of all, how many intermediaries would you like between something like a fox and a whale? 2? 22? 222 between a fox and a whale. The difference is so gigantic. 2,222? You want lots and lots and lots. Okay, I'm waiting for 41. 41, I think that's a small enough, reasonable number. Show me 41 different, spread out on the spectrum between a fox and a whale. They're not dreaming of that. Baloney, number one. And number two, they tell you about the leg bone. Then let me tell you a very sad story. You probably heard that the dinosaurs went extinct. That's not true. That's not true, or at least the theory that it's not true goes up and down. Every 5 or 10 years it shifts, right? Because according to many, the birds are dinosaurs. The birds came from the dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs never went extinct. They just evolved into the birds. That is to say, the flying dinosaurs evolved into the birds. And the Tyrannosaurus Rex is, lost out. Did birds come from dinosaurs or not? Every 5 years there's a change in mind about this, and each one calls the other side's ignoramuses and so on and so on. I have an article from a fellow named Larry Martin, who wrote an article. Now this is in an extinct journal called The Sciences. But if you want to find it, you can find the quotation in my you can find it on Google. You can find, just look up Larry Martin, The Sciences, and put it in quotation marks, and they'll get it for you. And in it, he's talking about the relationship between the dinosaur predecessors and the birds that came from them. And he's reviewing a book that says there are 85 anatomical features in common. 85 features. Man, that's a lot of features. That's a lot of features. 85 features in common? That's pretty convincing. I mean, even I as a layman, as an outsider, 85 features. Yeah, but you see, he is one of the world's experts on prehistoric birds, and he decided to do a detailed examination. And he says that to his shock, in investigating every one of the 85, Not one held up. Not 1 out of 85 held up. Not 1 out of 85. Such poor attention to detail, he writes, and such imaginative false reconstruction went into it that not 1 of the 85 holds up. Now that's pretty shocking. That's pretty shocking. Now you ask me, why do I pledge allegiance to Larry Martin? I don't. But if one group says they have 85 features in common and the other group says you have none, something's wrong. Something's desperately wrong. The method is not a good method. Your analysis is not a good analysis. Your way of drawing conclusions is not a good way of drawing conclusions. Something's desperately wrong. If it's 85 to 0, can I trust that? Now along came these same people and said, we found a leg bone in a whale. Well, maybe yes, and maybe no. I don't know. You don't know either. You're guessing, and you're strongly influenced by your desire to preserve evolution. So you say it's a leg bone. Do you know everything that goes on in the whale body? Do you know all the functions that it fulfills? Maybe in the embryological stage, it fulfills a crucial function in developing the embryo in a certain way, and then just carried along later. How do you know that it's a useless leg bone coming from a previous incarnation? Absolutely no reason to trust something like that. Yeah, I have 3 minutes. I'll mention something. One other thing. A lot is made out of similar forms, especially similar forms that perform different functions. The pentadactyl form. You have 5 fingers, remember? And 5 toes. Golly, how come? Well, the answer is certain animals have 5 digits on their legs, their feet. And certain fish have in their flippers 5 digits, 5 bones. Clearly, the 5 fish digits were evolved into the 5 animal digits, which evolved into the 5 human digits, and was carried along. Especially since the assumption is 5 isn't particularly best number for doing the different things they do. They do, after all, very different things. The flippers push water, and the feet are for walking on, and the hand is for grasping things. They're very different functions. No particular reason why 5 would be the best number for doing all those things. It was just carried along. Okay, you have 5 fingers because of your DNA. So do animals have 5 digits because of their DNA. So do the fish have 5 bones in their flippers because of their DNA. If we really got our digits from the animals and the animals got it from the fish, then you ought to be able to see in the DNA similar DNA that's carried along from stage to stage. If that's where we got it from, and the DNA is what produces it, then the DNA ought to be similar from stage to stage. But it isn't. It isn't analogous. It isn't homologous. The DNA that produces it is different and not related in the cases, not for any relationship that we can see. So then, this looks like evidence against pulling it along from the previous. You say, but if you didn't pull it along from the previous, where could it possibly have come from? Well, remember Ernst Mayr, the eye evolved independently 40 times in the history of life. 40 independent times. Nobody says, oh no, it's a string of 40. This one took it from this one, took it from this one, took it from this one. Nobody says that because they know that lines are distinct. So you have something called convergent evolution. Convergent evolution means similar structures arise in different lines. So you say, where did the 5 come from? In the fish and the animals and in us? Maybe it arose independently. We don't have to say that similar structure. There are pouched mammals in North and South America. There are pouched mammals in Australia. Did they cross the ocean to get from one to the other? Pangea is too old for that. So, obviously, pouchedness arose twice. It arose twice independently. So why must I think that my 5 digits came from the animals and the animals came from the fish? Especially when the DNA doesn't show it. Okay, I hope you get the gist of it. It's just there's lots and lots of critical stuff. But as I said at the outset, my goal tonight is not to show that it's false. My goal is to show that there isn't enough support to rationally believe that it's true. At the very best, a person could say, we don't know if it's true or not. it's a research program, and we can get government grants to study it, and we can write books, and, if you're Richard Dawkins, you could... You know what Richard Dawkins did at Oxford? His chair was in the public understanding of science. He's not a research scientist. He didn't do research science. His profession was the public understanding of science, explaining science to the layman. That explains, but doesn't justify some of the gross errors that he made. Read Stephen Jay Gould on Richard Dawkins. Scathing attack on his incompetence. At any rate, I'm just illustrating to you that anybody who tells you that if you don't believe the theories of evolution, you're irrational, you're dogmatist, you're out of tune with the times, you're an ignoramus, is absolutely incorrect. The opposite is correct. Anybody who believes it is a dogmatist. He's not willing to look at the data. He's not willing to look at the arguments and the logic. And as you see in the wars on the blogs, the believers in evolution use character assassination, insult. One guy, Stephen Myers, a writer in this area, he has a PhD in philosophy of science from Cambridge University. Not too bad, I would say. And he wrote a book called Signature in the Cell about the information in the cell and how it can't be explained in evolutionary terms. And one guy writes, "This book is junk. It's so bad I didn't read it." What? You're saying it's so bad and you didn't read it? And he's not embarrassed. He's not embarrassed by that. I would have thought any self-respecting person wouldn't say in the same breath that it's junk and he didn't read it. He's not embarrassed by that. That's the level of debate coming from their side. That's the level of discussion coming from their side. It's crude in the extreme. Thomas Nagel, because he made a couple of remarks favorable to ID, got the same treatment. It's an embarrassment to the academic world that people do that. And the people who are supporting intelligent design and criticizing evolution, by and large, are keeping a very low interpersonal profile. They're presenting the arguments, they're presenting the evidence, they're presenting they'll point out the foils are there, but there's no character assassination, so just simply they're pointing it out. And there's lots and lots and lots of it. So I think that the bottom line is there's certainly not enough reason to believe that the theory of evolution is true.